The rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming relentlessly against the rusted metal roof of the wildlife shelter. The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth and disinfectant, pierced only by the occasional creak of aging cages and the low, steady beep of life-monitoring machines. But in the farthest enclosure, isolated from the others and wrapped in shadow, silence reigned. There, lying motionless on a stained concrete floor, was a massive bear. His once mighty frame was now just a heap of matted fur and bone. His breathing was ragged and shallow, barely stirring the straw beneath him. A single overhead light flickered above the cage, casting him in a ghostly glow. Two shelter workers stood just outside the enclosure, whispering in low, uncertain tones. "He's not going to make it through the night," one murmured. "Should have gone through with it yesterday," the other replied, glancing nervously at the clipboard in his hands. "It's cruel to wait." Inside the bear's enclosure, the creature didn't move. His eyes remained closed, his sides barely rising. The bear, once a circus performer known as Balthazar, had become a shell of himself. Found abandoned behind a defunct roadside circus 3 weeks ago, he'd been suffering from untreated pneumonia, severe malnutrition, and infected wounds from chains that had eaten into his skin. Veterinarians had done all they could, but the consensus was grim. He was beyond saving. Too weak to eat, too large to be transported elsewhere without risking cardiac arrest, and too far gone to recover naturally. There was no hope, only time. And now, even that was running out. In the office across the hall, the decision was made. The director of the shelter, flanked by 2 veterinary officials and a wildlife representative, lowered his voice as he leaned over the table. "We'll proceed with humane euthanasia at dawn. No press, no announcement. We keep this quiet for his dignity." The others nodded solemnly. "It's mercy," someone said. But not everyone watching that night agreed. Miles away, in a small house lit only by the flicker of a television screen, 12-year-old Lila sat cross-legged on the floor. Her dark eyes were locked on the news segment playing before her. A reporter spoke solemnly about the bear, calling it a tragic case of failed rescue. As an image of the dying animal flashed on the screen, Lila's breath caught in her throat. She knew that bear. It wasn't the kind of thing a person forgets. Years ago, when she was only 7, her parents had taken her to a traveling circus off the interstate. She remembered the garish colors, the loud music, the artificial cheer. But most of all, she remembered him, the enormous bear who shuffled awkwardly onto the stage, wearing a ridiculous hat and standing on hind legs to perform a trick with a ball. Everyone had clapped, but Lila hadn't, because when their eyes met for a brief second under the big top lights, the bear's sadness had pierced straight through her. His eyes weren't wild or threatening. They were tired, human, pleading. And now he was dying. Lila stood abruptly, knocking over a glass of juice beside her. Her father, sitting on the couch behind her, looked up in surprise. "I have to go to him," she said, voice trembling but steady. "Lila." Her father started, unsure whether to laugh or scold. "It's late. It's a bear. It's not our fight." "No," she said firmly, turning to face him. "It is. I saw him once and I didn't do anything. I have to go now." "Sweetheart, they said he's going to be put down. There's nothing anyone can do." But her eyes were blazing now. "I can. I don't know how, but I have to try." What followed was a blur of determination. Lila grabbed her raincoat. Her father, torn between reason and the fire in his daughter's voice, gave in with a sigh and grabbed the keys. As the storm intensified, their car slipped through wet streets toward the shelter. Back at the facility, the bear still hadn't moved. The staff had dimmed the lights, preparing the space in quiet respect. But the mood was broken when the front door slammed open with a gust of wind. Lila burst through, soaked to the skin, eyes scanning the room like a soldier on a mission. "You can't be in here," a worker called after her. But she didn't stop, past the empty reception desk, past the posters for adoption events, past the protesters huddled under umbrellas outside, shouting about ethics and animal rights. She walked straight through the corridor, water dripping from her sleeves, heart pounding louder than the thunder outside. Then she saw him. The cage was larger than she expected, and the bear smaller. He looked so fragile now, like a crumpled rug someone had left behind. The machines beeped softly beside him, counting out the final moments. Lila ignored the voices behind her. She stepped up to the bars, trembling, and slowly knelt down. No one spoke. She pressed her hand against the cold metal, staring at the bear's still form. And then, softly, almost inaudibly, she whispered, "You're not alone anymore." For a moment, nothing happened. And then the bear moved. It wasn't much, just a twitch of his ear, a barely perceptible shift in his breathing. But for the staff, frozen behind her, it was like watching a ghost come back to life. Did he just— Wait, look at his eyes. The bear's lids fluttered open, just barely. Enough for Lila to meet his gaze again. And when she did, the same ache she'd seen years ago was still there. But this time, there was something else too. Recognition. One of the vets took a hesitant step forward. He hasn't responded to anything in days. Not light, not noise, not food, nothing. But he had responded to her. Lila turned to face them, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "Please, don't kill him," she said. "He's still in there. I can feel it." Silence fell over the room, broken only by the rhythmic pulse of the machines, and the distant wind was stale, and the animals weren't smiling behind the bright colors. Lila had been 7, small, wide-eyed, and holding tightly to her mother's hand as they found their seats in the tent. She remembered the lights flashing, the booming music, the clown with 2 red lips. And then, him. A curtain had parted. The announcer's voice had dipped to a hush, like revealing a king. "Ladies and gentlemen, the incredible, the untamable, Balthazar." The bear had entered slowly, wearing a ridiculous red vest and tiny pointed hat. The crowd roared, laughing, clapping, expecting tricks. But Lila hadn't laughed. She'd watched as he shuffled to the center ring, unsteady, his shoulders hunched like he carried invisible weight. The trainer barked a command. The bear rose onto his hind legs, caught a wobbling rubber ball and tossed it into a hoop. But then he dropped it. There was a collective gasp, then laughter. But behind the laughter, from where Lila sat close to the stage, she saw what no one else seemed to. The trainer's smile froze. The curtain flapped, and behind it, hidden from the audience, was the end of a metal prod. Later that night, while the crowd funneled out and balloons were handed to sticky fingers, Lila had wandered from her parents for just a moment. She peeked behind that curtain, and she saw him, caged, bleeding from a fresh welt on his side, eyes downcast, the trainer's voice still hissing curses. She didn't speak, she didn't cry out. She just watched, her tiny hand clenched over her mouth, and then ran. She'd never forgotten that moment. Not a single day since. And now, years later, Lila was back, kneeling before the same bear in the shelter, whispering soft, broken apologies through iron bars. "I'm sorry I left you. I should have done something. But I'm here now. I promise I'm not leaving again." Inside the cage, Balthazar blinked. His body remained limp, but his breathing deepened, steadier than before. A few staff members stood nearby, uncertain and silent. No one had dared break the spell. The girl, so young, seemed to exist on another frequency, one the bear could hear but no one else could reach. Dr. Marquez, a recently appointed volunteer vet and trauma specialist, stepped into the room. He'd heard the commotion, the girl's arrival. Now, watching from the doorway, his brows furrowed. "Who is she?" he asked the director. "No one," the man replied, shaking his head. "Just a kid who saw something on the news." But Dr. Marquez wasn't convinced. The monitor beside the bear's enclosure beeped. Respiration was stabilizing. Just slightly, but measurably. That hadn't happened in days. "She's not just a kid," he murmured. Inside the cage, Balthazar stirred again. A paw twitched. One eye opened more fully, scanning the room, then landing back on the girl. Lila turned to the staff, voice steady but desperate. "Give me 48 hours. A laugh escaped someone in the back. "You're asking us to halt a scheduled euthanasia based on what? Puppy eyes and a bedtime story." "No," Lila said firmly. "I'm asking you to give him a chance. Just 2 days. If he doesn't improve, I'll leave. I won't fight it. But if I'm right, if there's even one part of him that wants to live, he deserves a chance to try." The director shook his head, frustrated. "It's not just about want. He's medically unsalvageable. There's no precedent for this." But then, Dr. Marquez stepped forward. "There's no precedent, but there's no harm either," he said gently. "His condition has been stable, though critical, for 3 days. She's done more to stimulate him in 5 minutes than we've been able to do in 3 weeks. If she's wrong, he won't suffer more than he already is. But if she's right—" Silence again. The director hesitated, then sighed. 48 hours, that's it. You don't leave his side. If anything worsens, anything at all, we resume protocol. Understood?" Lila nodded, tears springing to her eyes. "Understood." The plan began at once. Under Dr. Marquez's supervision, Lila stayed overnight in the shelter. They moved a cot beside the cage. The staff brought her broth, and she delicately used a plastic syringe to drip it into the corner of the bear's mouth. He didn't resist. She sang to him softly, songs from childhood, lullabies her mother had sung to her. Between songs, she whispered words only the bear seemed to understand. She told him about her life, her fears, the guilt that had haunted her for years. And between whispered words and trickled broth, she gently cleaned the grime from his fur with a warm, damp rag. Hours passed. Then a day, and the bear began to change. It was subtle, a shift in posture, a more even breath. He licked his lips for the first time. Then, while Lila hummed beside him late that night, his massive head lifted, just barely, off the ground. The staff stood stunned. Dr. Marquez reviewed the data. Heart rate, previously erratic, now showed signs of rhythm. Fever was breaking. He was still incredibly fragile, but undeniably moving in the right direction. The word got out. A local reporter, tipped off by a former intern, ran the headline, "Dying Circus Bear Responds Only to Young Girl Who Refused to Let Him Go." The story spread like wildfire. Social media lit up with hashtags, "Let Him Live," Balthazar, and Lila. 48 hours. News trucks began parking outside the shelter. Protesters returned, this time not demanding mercy through death, but hope through life. The shelter's director was furious. "This was never meant to be public," he snapped at his staff. "We can't run a facility based on emotions and headlines." But the momentum couldn't be stopped. By the second night, Lila hadn't slept more than an hour. Her voice was hoarse. Her hands were blistered from wiping, feeding, cleaning. But she refused to leave his side. And then, just after midnight, a shelter worker passing by the bear's cage stopped in her tracks. Balthazar was rising. Shakily, legs trembling like wet branches in the wind, he lifted himself into a standing position. Just enough to lean his weight against the bars. Inside the cage, his massive chest heaved, but he remained upright. Lila, half asleep, was humming the same lullaby she'd sung the night before. The worker fumbled for her phone. Record. She uploaded the video in real time. By morning, it had 2.2 million views. The bear stood up while she sang, "Watch This" with sound. That morning, the world saw what the shelter staff already knew. Something unbelievable was happening. Something no one could explain. And it had everything to do with a girl who refused to stay silent a second time.